When I returned from the bathroom at the company party, I saw my wife leaving with her lover, laughing as if the world around her didn't exist. I didn't follow. I grabbed my coat, left the room, and with it, our story. In the following days, her silence confirmed what I saw. It was betrayal, not deception. Time showed that her lover didn't want commitment, only the game, and she was left alone, with the bitter taste of regret. I moved on, painful at first, but I found peace in the eyes of a new love, made of respect and genuine presence. Months later, she wrote me, saying she would trade everything for another chance. I responded with what I had to, forgiveness. She thought that after forgiveness we could be a couple again, but it was then that I introduced her to my new partner, and her penny dropped. That moment was like watching silence invade a battlefield. Nothing was said right away, but there was more pain and understanding in her eyes than any apology could explain. The expression on her face, frozen, as if finally faced with the true extent of what she had lost, was the missing final point in a story written with wounds, omissions, and a kind of carelessness that kills slowly. I said nothing at that moment. I didn't need to. My presence beside another woman, not just a replacement, but someone who saw me for who I was, not a convenient reflection, said it all. She had made her choice. Mine. But up until that point, up until that exact moment her eyes met hers, I know that, deep down, she still believed she would have me back. As if time could be turned back with just a message, a tear, or a belated confession. Betrayal, in the end, wasn't what destroyed me. What shattered me into 1,000 pieces was realizing she never hesitated. That she laughed. That she lived that moment as if it were liberation, not rupture. She didn't hesitate, didn't tremble, didn't seek my gaze before leaving. She left. She left like someone crossing a bridge, burning behind any possibility of return. She laughed, and that laugh haunted me for days. Because it wasn't just the laugh of someone happy, it was the laugh of someone who no longer cares about the one they left behind. And yet, I was the one left with the pain. I was the one who woke up the next day trying to understand when we stopped being us. When love became routine, routine became burden, and burden became an excuse to seek in another body what we once swore to each other with such certainty. At first, I looked for faults in myself. You know that phase where you blame yourself for everything? I've gone over the last few months trying to understand where I went wrong. If it was the fatigue, the automatic responses, the lack of attention, the declined invitations, the silent dinners. If it was me who stopped trying. But then, little by little, I began to realize, the betrayal had been building long before that night. It didn't start at the party. It started when she started hiding her phone, when hugs became protocol and kisses a soulless gesture. It started when I still believed we were just going through a rough patch. When, in fact, I still believed love endured. And when I realized this, it hurt even more. Because love endured, but only in me. Her silence in the following days was deafening. No attempt to explain, no confession. Just the echo of absence, as if we were living an invisible mourning. She didn't deny it, didn't apologize, didn't justify it. As if she thought silence hurt less than the truth. But the truth, even when it's harsh, is liberating. Silence, that's what corrodes. And perhaps she thought that by remaining silent she would avoid the weight of guilt. But remaining silent only made me see even more clearly what I didn't want to accept. There was no regret. Only leakage. And when her lover left her, predictably, she felt the pain she ignored in me. And when he tried to come back, when he finally reached out asking for a chance, believe me, I almost gave in. Almost. Because love, however hurt, still recognizes the old scent, still remembers the promises whispered in the dark, still misses the routine that, though lukewarm, was home. But something in me had already changed. I was no longer the same man. Pain transformed me. Loneliness rebuilt me. And it was in this rebuilding that I met someone who didn't come to fill a hole, nor to erase the past, but to look into my eyes and say, I'm here. And I see you. And I, for the first time in a long time, found myself loved without needing to explain myself. Without needing to compete with memories or ghosts. A new, calm, noiseless love. A love that didn't come to shine brighter, but to illuminate where before there was only shadow. And when it returned, begging for another chance, it was too late. And it wasn't out of revenge that I denied it. It was out of love for myself. Because I understood, then and there, that loving someone who betrayed us is accepting being wounded once more by the same blade. I clearly remember the day everything became final. She ran into me by chance, or maybe it wasn't by chance, in a restaurant where we used to celebrate our wedding anniversaries. She called me by name, as if that simple sound could make me forget everything. I stared at her in silence. She came closer, said with teary eyes that she forgave me, that she understood what she'd lost. That she'd traded all for another Sunday, for a pizza in front of the TV, for that silent coffee I'd previously called boredom. You said you understood now. That only now did you realize that happiness doesn't scream. That true love doesn't have to be explosive, just constant. That only now did you realize that what we experienced was rare. That the other offered nothing more than vanity, a momentary validation that evaporated in the first fight. I remained silent. She looked at me as if begging for a chance. But I had nothing more to offer. I was already living another story. And then she asked, in a whisper, if there was anyone. I simply turned and called, and my new companion came. Smiling. Light-hearted. With the eyes of someone who had never betrayed me or needed scandals to love me. The look on my ex's face, upon seeing who now occupied the place she had thrown away, was the true ending of our story. An ending without shouting, without arguments, but with a silence so profound that it echoes to this day. She cried. And for the first time since then, I felt compassion. Not for her, but for what she'd lost. Because I knew. I'd been there. I knew what it was like to live with someone who truly loved you. And knowing she'd never have that with me again, was a punishment greater than any revenge. She still tried to say something to me, but before a word could escape, we were interrupted by an old friend of the couple. He approached, smiling, visibly surprised to see me with him. And before any formality, he looked at her and said, "Wow, you threw away the best man I've ever seen love a woman." He spoke of you with a sparkle in his eyes, with a rare admiration. You know what you lost, right? Her silence answered. And in that moment, I realized I would never again be the man she knew. But I also understood that, despite the pain, I had won. Because I moved on. Because I started over. And because I learned that the love that doesn't betray is the only one worth fighting to keep. But if you think the story ends there, it's because you still don't know what she did after that. And much less what I discovered about her, weeks later. The true end of this story was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, we condemn it. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they reflect hard truths. Betrayal destroys, corrodes homes, shatters souls, and leaves scars that time doesn't always heal. Our purpose is clear, to show, with each story, that a wrong choice can cost you the love of your life. Prepare to feel, reflect, and never forget. Press play. Today's story will shock you. They met on a sultry September afternoon, the kind where the heat presses harder on the soul than on the skin, and everything seems to move in slow motion. He was centered, serene, with the demeanor of someone who always knew what they wanted from life, but who carried a kind of ancient sadness in his eyes, as if he'd lived more than time allowed. She was impulsive, full of light, one of those people who walk into a room and automatically change the air. She wasn't outrageously beautiful, but there was a quiet magnetism about her, a kind of presence that made everyone around turn at least once to observe her. Their meeting wasn't one of those cinematic coincidences. It was simple, almost banal, a casual conversation in a crowded cafe, where they were both forced to share a table due to lack of space. But what began as an inconvenience transformed, minutes later, into an easy conversation, as if they had met before, in some forgotten life. His name was Daniel. An advertising professional for almost a decade, he worked at a respected agency, not because he was brilliant or revolutionary, but because of his consistency, responsibility, and relentless ethics. He was the kind of man who kept promises, even if it cost him sleepless nights and personal compromises. He had few friends, but good ones, and a strained relationship with his family. His childhood had been marked by absences, a father who left too soon and a mother who spent her life trying to make up for what was once two jobs. Perhaps that's why Daniel never took many risks. He had a mature relationship with time, money, and feelings. He gave himself slowly, but when he did, it was completely. Her name was Laura. She was a literature teacher at a private school, passionate about poetry, the drama of existence, and everything involving raw emotion. She had a restless soul, the kind that doesn't settle easily, constantly searching for something more she couldn't define. She came from a structured but emotionally unstable family. Her parents were present but distant, and she had a sister with whom she maintained an intense relationship, sometimes loving, sometimes competitive. Laura was always afraid of getting lost in routines, of becoming a spectator of her own life. That's why she threw herself into it. She loved intensely, cried easily, laughed too loudly, and immersed herself in anything that could make her feel something, anything, even if it cost her dearly later. The beginning of their relationship was shrouded in a kind of mutual enchantment. Daniel saw in Laura a freedom he'd never had the courage to seek, and Laura saw in Daniel a safe haven that made her feel, for the first time, like she could stop running. She loved listening to his stories about advertising campaigns, the rational ideas with which he tried to shape the world around him, and he was fascinated by the way she quoted authors, as if each sentence from an old book were an urgent lesson about the present. They had stark differences, yes, but also a desire to fit in that, for a time, seemed enough to balance everything. The first few months were intense. Short trips, lazy Sundays sharing breakfast, notes left on the bathroom mirror, text messages mid-work just to say, "I miss you." Over time, they began living together in a small but cozy apartment, filled with scattered books and paintings with quotes from Clarice Lispector, Fernando Pessoa, and Bukowski, a mix as chaotic as they themselves. The apartment wasn't luxurious, but it was warm. It was the kind of place where the smell of coffee filled the living room in the morning and shared laughter became the soundtrack to any ordinary day. Daniel quickly adapted to the new routine. He liked coming home from work and finding Laura barefoot, sitting on the floor, grading papers or reading the same passage from a book for the third time. He liked the way she teased him, how she laughed at his fears yet respected them. Laura, in turn, felt safe. There was a stability there she could never quite name, but which she immediately recognized as rare. A kind of peace that seemed to contradict everything she had ever sought. Sometimes she wondered if she was betraying herself by accepting this. But his touch, a caring gesture, was enough to melt all her doubts away. The relationship grew and matured. Plans were made, furniture was purchased together, a puppy was adopted on a rainy afternoon. Silences, disagreements, and fatigue also arrived. But nothing that didn't seem like a part of real life. Daniel, with his calm demeanor, resolved conflicts through dialogue, while Laura, more impulsive, exploded before thinking. Still, they always returned to each other. It was as if, despite all their differences, there was a truth there that held them together. A kind of invisible foundation that sustained their love through good times and bad. During the first 3 years of their marriage, the two maintained a functional routine, somewhat vibrant, but lacking the same initial enchantment. Laura began teaching a night class, which left her out of the house almost every night. Daniel, meanwhile, took on a major project at the agency, demanding more hours of dedication and, often, entire weekends of work. They still loved each other, but now it was a love that had to be managed between spreadsheets, meetings, and school calendars. Conversations diminished. Nights together became rarer. Kisses became more hurried. Touching became more casual. There was affection, but also fatigue. Companionship, but little new. Daniel, despite his demanding schedule, remained dedicated. He was the kind of person who remembered dates, who bought flowers out of season, who wrote notes even when there was no special occasion. Laura, however, was beginning to feel swallowed up by everyday life. The restlessness that had always plagued her returned with a vengeance. She began to wonder if she had made the right choices, if she wasn't becoming exactly what she had always feared, another woman stuck in a predictable pattern, trapped in a safe but emotionless life. She tried to fight these thoughts, but they grew silently, in the gaps left by her husband's absence and by the routines that once seemed romantic, but now felt like obligation. Sometimes she missed the beginning, the intensity, the lack of control. Daniel noticed the distance, but believed it was temporary, a result of stress and changes in their professional lives. He watched her fondly, but also with a hint of frustration. He no longer knew how to surprise her, how to recapture the lightness that had once united them. He thought time would take care of it, that the phase would pass, that they would soon find their way back. So he insisted on dinners even when she wasn't in the mood, made travel plans even when she claimed to be tired, and worked hard to keep alive something that, without realizing it, was already slipping through his fingers. They were still together, but something between them had changed. An invisible distance was beginning to form. There were no fights, no shouting. Just a subtle silence growing day by day, like a barely perceptible crack that threatens the foundation of any building. They still slept in the same bed, but their dreams no longer met. They still shared the same house, but their emotions seemed to be in different directions. She started going out more, saying she needed to clear her head. He stayed, believing that trust was enough to avoid questioning. And perhaps it was. Or perhaps, precisely because he trusted too much, he failed to notice what was already looming on the horizon. To outsiders, they were the ideal couple. Beautiful together, stable, companionable. But what the world saw was just a frame. Inside, the painting was already beginning to fade. There was still love, or at least a strong memory of it. But there were also doubts, unspoken silences, unshared desires. Daniel still believed. Laura still hesitated. But time waits for no certainty. And somewhere along the way, everything solid began to become fragile, until the moment when the truth, merciless, would present itself without asking permission. But that was yet to happen. Their life together was, for a long time, sustained by the unilateral effort of those who believed that love endured silence, absence, and the silent changes in the tone of voice and the rhythm of embraces. Daniel persisted with the devotion of someone who believes that wear and tear is fleeting, that distant glances are the result of fatigue, not disinterest. He woke early, made coffee with the same careful gestures as years ago, and still placed her glass of juice to the left, as he knew she preferred. He alternated between hope and fear, between optimism and the silent anguish of realizing that his efforts were no longer yielding the same results. Laura was there, physically present, but emotionally miles away. Their answers became curt, their glances were lost in vague corners of the house, and their embraces grew colder, as if between them there were an invisible barrier he couldn't quite cross. Laura, on the other hand, was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't even name. She found herself torn between guilt and a vague longing for something she didn't even fully understand. The security of home no longer fulfilled her, and Daniel's predictability, which had once brought her comfort, now seemed stagnant. There was no heartbreak, or at least that's what she told herself, but there was a thirst to feel something new, to rediscover within herself that intense woman who had lost herself in routines, deadlines, and demands. Doubt seeped in like a slow poison, corroding her perception of reality, leading her to question if she was still the same person who had once fallen in love with him. The affection remained, but the desire, the surprise, the spark, all of it seemed to have been left behind at some bend in the road from which she no longer remembered how to return. It was on one of those confusing days, when the soul craves noise to silence the mind, that Laura reconnected with someone from the past. Not an ex-lover, not someone remarkable, but a familiar face that suddenly took on a new color. He was a coworker with whom she'd exchanged few words until then, but who seemed to know exactly what to say to trigger feelings in her that had long been dormant. His attentive gaze, the compliments disguised as innocent comments, his easy laugh, everything in her awakened when he approached. At first, she felt flattered. Then, intrigued. And finally, captivated. It was as if this man brought back a version of herself that had disappeared into commitments and the role of wife. They began with conversations during breaks, then exchanged messages after hours, and then came the coffees, the accidental touches, the looks that lingered longer than they should. Daniel noticed the change, but couldn't put a name to it. He felt something was off, like a song playing out of rhythm, but he couldn't quite place the sound. Laura stayed at work longer, arrived late, avoided deep conversations, and traded intimacy for distractions. When he asked, she answered evasively, commitments, meetings, fatigue. He, out of respect or fear of the answer, didn't insist. He continued making plans, trying to create moments together, offering small gestures of affection. But it was like watering a dead plant, hoping it would miraculously bloom again. The house, once warm and vibrant, now carried the weight of the unsaid, the avoided, the accumulated discomfort. Smiles became scarce, dinners silent, weekends filled with obligations that conveniently kept them apart. While Daniel tried to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers, Laura dove deeper into this new relationship. There wasn't a single moment when everything crossed the line. It was an accumulation of small permissions, emotional excuses, and intimate justifications about what she deserved to feel. Her lover was everything Daniel wasn't, unpredictable, bold, and free of commitment. He made her laugh effortlessly, complimented her gestures naturally, and looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. Laura let herself go, while simultaneously constructing a narrative for herself where it was, in a way, understandable. After all, she was living a half-life, and this new man seemed to fill the void that Daniel, no matter how hard he tried, could no longer reach. The distance between them gradually solidified. Daniel felt her absence even when she was beside him. He began to notice details more closely, her phone always face down, her sudden change of perfume, the way she smiled when she received notifications. One night, she left saying she was meeting up with friends, something he'd heard before. But that night, he felt something different. A tightness in his chest that wasn't just intuition, it was almost a certainty. He tried not to entertain thoughts, tried to sleep, but turned over countless times in a bed that seemed too huge. When she returned, she avoided his gaze, went straight to the shower, and lay down without saying goodnight. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling as if something had definitely broken. In the following days, the tension between them became palpable. Communication, once difficult, now seemed non-existent. Laura avoided touch, avoided even the longest glances, and any attempts at closeness were met with monosyllabic responses. Daniel constantly wondered where he had gone wrong, what more he could do. One night, he prepared a special dinner. He lit candles, played soft music, and tried to recreate the atmosphere that had once brought them together. When she arrived, she said she was tired, not hungry, and went to her room. Daniel sat at the table, staring at his untouched plate, his eyes filled with unshed tears. He no longer recognized the woman he had chosen to love. And, worst of all, he felt she no longer recognized him either. The confirmation came at the agency's end-of-year party. A formal event, full of rehearsed smiles, corporate gifts, and songs too upbeat for weary hearts. Daniel was there because he needed to be. Laura accompanied him, as always. She wore a red dress that emphasized her presence, and throughout the evening, she seemed restless. She checked her cell phone countless times, moved away at strategic moments, and smiled rarely. At one point, she said she needed to go to the bathroom. He nodded, unsuspecting. Minutes later, she felt uneasy, something indefinable, and decided to go look for her. She couldn't find her in the bathroom. Or in the hallway. He headed for the exit and, as he passed through the glass door of the salon, saw something he would never forget. Outside, leaning against another man's car, she was laughing. Laughing in a way he hadn't seen in months. The man looked at her with open desire, and she responded with the naturalness of someone who no longer needed to hide it. She laughed as if the world around her had ceased to exist. Daniel stood still for endless seconds, caught between shock and disappointment. There were no screams, no scandal. Just silence. A silence that said it all. She returned, grabbed her coat, and without looking back, left the room, and with it, the story he'd built for years. What hurt him most wasn't the kiss he almost saw, nor the touch between them. It was her laughter. That free, light, almost childlike laugh. The kind of laughter she hadn't shared with him in a long time. And in that moment, he knew he'd lost her. And more than that, he knew she'd already allowed herself to be lost. But there was something still unrevealed. Something she didn't say. Something that, when revealed, will change everything Daniel believes he knows about that betrayal. Because not everything in that story was a coincidence. And not everyone involved was there just for the hell of it. Time passed as it does for those who suffer, slow, drawn out, heavy. Daniel didn't leave the scene impulsively, but definitively. After that night, he didn't confront Laura, didn't demand explanations, didn't demand truths. He simply disappeared from her routine, like a page turned silently but irrevocably. He changed his tone, changed his habits, changed the key to the door and to his soul. He moved on, even though bleeding inside, even though broken, because he understood that, even though love still existed, there was no longer reciprocity. And that was enough. Over time, the pain settled elsewhere within him. It stopped hurting like an open wound and began to hurt like a memory. But it didn't stop him from rebuilding his life, calmly, with effort, with dignity. It wasn't long before someone appeared in his path. Not as a replacement, but as a new beginning. A discreet, intelligent, sweet, and strong woman, the kind who doesn't try to occupy space that isn't hers, but who, upon arriving, illuminates without casting a shadow. She didn't need to compete with the past, because the future, with her by her side, proved promising and serene. Daniel chose her not as an escape, but as a conscious choice of someone who finally understood her own worth. Laura, on the other hand, saw the enchantment fade faster than she imagined. The lover who had made her laugh lightly began to burden her with a weight she couldn't bear. Mystery turned to boredom, excitement turned to doubt, and freedom suddenly turned to loneliness. She tried to extend the relationship beyond fantasy, but encountered resistance. He wasn't willing to be part of a reconstruction. He wanted only what was forbidden. And when that ceased to be, he ceased to be, too. He disappeared unceremoniously, without a pretty ending, like everything that never had roots. Laura tried to appear strong, to convince herself it was just a phase, but little by little, Daniel's absence began to hurt more than his presence ever had. She began to sleep poorly, revisit old photos, listen to songs she'd previously hated, now like silent punches to her conscience. She wrote and rewrote messages she never sent, rehearsed conversations that never happened. And then, one day, she wrote. Not to apologize, but to ask for a chance. He said he would trade everything, that he had finally understood the value of what he had, that now he knew what love really was. Daniel responded with a single word, forgiveness. But there, in that answer, lay an abyss. She believed forgiveness would open the door to a new beginning, but he knew forgiveness was the end. And he was certain of it the day she saw him holding hands with his new wife, walking through the park where they used to spend Sundays. Laura watched them from a distance, as if watching their own life being lived by someone else. There was a harmony there that struck her without needing words. And the final blow came days later, when she tried to approach him in person, and Daniel received her with serenity, respect, but with a firmness she had never seen in him. He said life had moved on, that he had found peace, and that he hoped one day she would too. When she asked, with a trembling voice, if there was another woman, he beckoned her with his gaze. And she came. Beautiful, simple, light, with a sincere smile that needed no competition. In that moment, Laura understood everything. What she had lost. And what would never return. But that wasn't what destroyed her. It wasn't the pain of seeing him move on, nor the shock of realizing she was now the one left on the outside. What completely dismantled her happened 2 weeks later, at a coffee shop where, by chance, she ran into an old mutual friend of the couple. He was one of those close friends who, over time and through life's natural separations, ended up losing touch. He approached her naturally, smiling, unaware of the separation. Seeing Laura alone, he casually asked how Daniel was, and she, trying to maintain some dignity, responded with a restrained smile, saying he was fine but that they had separated. The friend seemed surprised, but didn't judge. He simply looked at her with a mixture of empathy and suppressed disappointment. He started to change the subject, but hesitated. And that's when everything fell apart. He said, almost in a tone of defiance, that he had always admired their relationship. He remembered how Daniel would talk about her at gatherings with friends, how he would mention her with a sparkle in his eyes, with genuine pride. He said that once, when the group asked what made Daniel so happy in his marriage, he answered without hesitation, because she's my best choice. With her, I'm myself. And if one day she leaves me, I won't rebel, I'll just accept it, because at least I truly lived with her. The sentence fell on Laura like an impossible weight to bear. His friend added, he loved you with an intensity we rarely see. You had a man who spoke of you as if he were talking about how lucky he was. As if he were grateful for your existence. Laura lost her footing. There was no more discussion, no justifications, no defenses. This wasn't an opinion. It was the naked truth. And it hurt more than any confrontation. She smiled weakly, thanked him for the conversation, left the coffee shop in silence, crossed the street without looking either way, got into her car, and stood there, motionless, her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes welling up. She felt the weight of what she had lost, not just the man, but the version of herself that existed beside him. She realized that the love she had had was pure, whole, rare. That she never needed to prove anything, never needed to shout, because it was always constant. She remembered the days when Daniel would wait for her with dinner ready, the notes left on the mirror, the attempts at conversation that she avoided, the nights when he would ask if everything was okay and she would say yes, even when everything was wrong. She remembered the last trip, the last laugh, the last touch. And she cried. She cried like someone who understands, too late, that time cannot be recovered, that some losses cannot be repaired, that regret is a prison you enter with your own hands. That night, Laura wrote another message. She didn't ask for another chance. She simply said she understood now. That he deserved the peace he'd found. And that she hoped one day to forgive herself for wasting the love of her life. Daniel read the message in silence. He didn't respond. He was on the balcony with his new partner, sharing a glass of wine and laughing at something light. He felt at peace. And in that silence, of someone who no longer needs to explain themselves, there was something only those who have suffered for love understand, liberation. But what Laura didn't know, and what would only come to light weeks later, was that her betrayal was much more than an unfortunate choice. She had been a tool of a game. Because the man she'd let herself be carried away by, the lover who'd offered her so much illusion, had motivations that went beyond desire or passion. And when the truth about him was revealed, she would understand that it wasn't just Daniel she'd betrayed. It was herself. And that perhaps. I was never truly loved by that other man. The true reason for the closeness was still hidden, ready to surface. And when it did, nothing would make sense anymore. Time passed with its usual irony, leaving scars in the silence of those who stayed and deep marks on those who tried to return. Laura, although she had never been rejected before, now felt the raw force of a no that came not with anger, but with peace. And this peace hurt more than any argument. Daniel didn't yell, didn't expose, didn't humiliate. He just followed. And that made her understand that she had truly lost. Not just any man, but a kind of love you only experience once, if you're lucky. Still, there was something Laura needed to say, something that throbbed inside her with an urgency that grew with each passing day. The message she had sent weeks ago wasn't enough. Not for her. She needed to look him in the eyes and say something she had never had the courage to say. Something she had kept hidden even from herself. And that, while it wouldn't change the past, could perhaps ease the guilt she carried. It was on a cloudy late afternoon, with a muggy temperature and a restless wind, that she summoned her courage. She knew where he usually was on Thursdays, a discreet park in the neighborhood where he always sought refuge to read and think. And, indeed, there he was, sitting on one of the benches, book in hand, posture relaxed, but eyes attentive to the world. Laura approached slowly, unsure if he would reject her before even hearing her. He sensed her presence in advance, but didn't react. He simply closed his book calmly and watched her approach. She stopped in front of him, her eyes carrying a silent plea. He, with the serenity of someone who no longer has expectations, gave a slight nod. Laura asked to sit down. He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. She sat down next to him, unsure where to begin. The silence between them was almost comfortable, but it soon became unbearable. Then she took a deep breath, looked straight ahead, not at him, and began to speak. She told him there was something Daniel needed to know. That it might be late, might be pointless, but for the sake of her own dignity, she needed to tell him. She said the man she'd gotten involved with wasn't just a coworker. There was more. There was a history between them that went back further, long before she met Daniel. Daniel didn't react immediately, but his expression changed. A subtle tension crept into his calm countenance. Laura continued. She explained that years before, when she was still in college, she had had a brief and intense relationship with a boy who never committed anything to her, but who made her believe there was something special. Someone who appeared and disappeared from her life as he pleased, always leaving subtle scars and returning when he knew she was still vulnerable. And that this same man, years later, reappeared in her life, just when she and Daniel were at their most fragile. Daniel had been listening silently, but now, his jaw tense, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor. Laura began to tremble. Her voice faltered as she explained that, for a long time, she believed this reunion had been chance. But now, after everything, she suspected it wasn't coincidence. That this man had approached her with a purpose. That he knew exactly who she was, and, more than that, who Daniel was. The impact of those words fell on Daniel like an invisible blade. He finally looked at her and asked, his voice low and firm, "Did he know me?" Laura nodded. She said she wasn't sure at first, but that, over time, their conversations had revealed details that left no doubt. He knew. He knew who Daniel was, he knew she was married to him. And still, he persisted. Daniel stood up and took a few steps, his hands in his pockets, his gaze lost amid the park's trees. Laura stood up too, trying to get closer, but he raised his hand slightly, as if asking for space, not out of anger, but out of a need to process. After a few seconds, he spoke, still without looking at her. He said that it didn't change what she'd done, but that it made it even more cruel. That the mistake was already serious, but if it was all planned, if he'd been chosen as the target of some kind of personal revenge, then his love for her was, somehow, used as a weapon. Laura tried to explain, saying she'd been manipulated, that she hadn't realized it at first, that she felt used to. But Daniel, now calmer, turned to her and said something that completely disarmed her, "You were used because you wanted to be used. Because somewhere inside you, there was a void you thought I couldn't fill. And now you've discovered that no one can fill what we can't name." Silence reigned again for a few moments. She wept silently, without drama, without pleas, just the heavy tears of someone who has lost something they no longer know how to rebuild. Daniel, for his part, showed no anger. There was a mixture of pain and compassion, as if he still cared, but from afar, as if he were watching from the outside the fall of something that was once his home. He said he didn't want to know who the other was. That the name didn't matter. What hurt was having been part of a plan, even if she herself didn't know it. He said the love he felt for her was true, but that now he understood, hers for him may never have been whole. Laura tried to deny it, tried to insist that there was love, that there was truth, but her words seemed fragile compared to the certainty he now held. Daniel looked at her one last time, and in a calm but definitive tone, said he hoped she would find what she was looking for. And that one day, when she finally understood what it meant to love someone other than herself, perhaps she would remember him with gratitude, not regret. And then he turned and walked away, leaving behind not only a broken woman, but an entire story built with true dedication, and shattered by a game he never knew was being played. Weeks later, in a conversation with a former co-worker, Daniel would discover the full truth. Laura's lover, the man she traded her entire life for, had been rejected by Daniel years earlier in a hiring process at the agency. A promising but arrogant young man, he felt humiliated at not being chosen. And since then, he'd cultivated a kind of silent obsession. He'd studied Daniel, followed his steps, his personal life, his relationships. He knew he was reserved, ethical, and loyal. And he decided to hit where it would hurt most, in the heart. His approach to Laura wasn't a coincidence, it was calculation. A cruel game of ego, wounded pride, and revenge. The kind of game only one side knows is happening. Daniel was silent for a long time after hearing this. The pain of betrayal took on a new layer, no longer just emotional, but existential. Because loving and being betrayed is brutal enough. But loving and being betrayed by something designed to destroy you, is inhumane. Still, he didn't seek out Laura. He didn't want to throw the truth in her face, didn't want to make her carry more guilt than she already did. He knew that life, with its unwavering and relentless rhythm, would show her what she herself still refused to see. The peace Daniel found with his new wife was now even more precious. Not by comparison, but by truth. Because it was a love born without strategy, without artifice, without pain. A light love, built on honesty. A love that needed no healing, because it arrived whole. And when I looked back, there was no more anger, no more hurt. Only the certainty that some losses are, in fact, deliverances. And that some betrayals, however devastating, make room for something infinitely better than what was lost. Laura, for her part, continued to live between regrets and attempts to move on. But the weight of knowing she'd been used by someone who never loved her, only to hurt another man, made everything even more unbearable. And worst of all, she'd allowed it. She'd not only betrayed the man who loved her, but betrayed herself. She'd traded truth for illusion, reality for a game. And now, all that remained were memories of a love she'd let die while still breathing. And so, the roles were reversed forever. She, alone, trying to find forgiveness within her own heart. He, finally at peace, living a love where there's no room for doubt, games, or loss. And between them, the story that could never be rewritten. Laura could no longer walk around the house without feeling her footsteps echo with guilt. The apartment that had once been her refuge began to feel like a living reminder of everything he'd destroyed. Every corner, every piece of furniture, every mark on the wall carried the memory of what he'd had and allowed to crumble. The sofa where they'd laughed during TV shows, the kitchen where he'd hugged her from behind while she made coffee, the hallway where they'd run around playing silly games on rainy days, everything was now just a scene from a time that seemed to belong to another life. The pain no longer came with fury, but with persistent melancholy. It was a calm, mature pain, the pain of someone who no longer deceives themselves, of someone who recognizes the extent of their own downfall. She no longer cried like before, but she didn't smile either. It was as if her heart had found a warm place, where it didn't burn, but also didn't beat with fullness. And in that place, she lived in silence, trying to understand how someone could lose so much without realizing they were losing. The people around her gradually returned to their normal lives. Most of her friends didn't know the details. They only noticed the difference. Laura avoided events, cut down on conversations, and made excuses to avoid social gatherings. Her sister tried to bring her back into the fold, but Laura couldn't maintain the facade. Every time she was in a group, she felt watched, judged, even if no one said anything. It was as if regret left a scent, an invisible presence in the air, perceptible to anyone who knew how to truly look. And no matter how hard she tried to forgive herself, she always stumbled upon the memory of that look in Daniel's eyes, calm but disappointed. There was no shouting there, but there was the cruelest kind of goodbye, the one said calmly, because there was nothing left to fight for. This absence of conflict was what hurt the most. He didn't want to argue, didn't want to fight back, didn't want to spill the pain back. He just moved on. And with that, he left the weight of all the bad choices upon her. Daniel, for his part, walked a line between reconstruction and introspection. Although he had a woman by his side who welcomed him with tenderness and truth, there were days when memory made him revisit ruins. Not out of longing, but out of reverence for his own history. Because it's impossible to move on completely without acknowledging the paths one has walked. He was a man at peace, but not a man who has forgotten. It wasn't about carrying resentment, but about respecting what he experienced, even if it ended badly. Sometimes he found himself thinking about how everything could have been different if, back then, he had seen the signs sooner, if he had said more, asked more questions, looked more closely. But these thoughts never lasted. Because, deep down, he knew, there was no saving what only one of them wanted to keep. It was like trying to keep a flame alive alone, in a room where the other opens all the windows to let the wind in. The new relationship blossomed slowly. There was mutual admiration, a complicity built with delicacy and conscious choices. The woman who now accompanied him wasn't someone who filled gaps, but someone who added value. Daniel didn't feel obligated to prove his worth again, and this freedom slowly healed him. For the first time, he was in a relationship where the truth didn't need to be defended at every turn. And, even with everything they'd been through, there was no room in his heart for comparisons. The past was where it belonged, and the present was cared for as if it were a rare plant, the kind that only blooms once in a lifetime. Meanwhile, Laura faced a moral dilemma that silently gnawed at her. After discovering that her lover had deliberately approached her, she began to review every detail of that relationship with new eyes. She not only felt used, but also complicit in something she now recognized as perverse. It wasn't just the infidelity that weighed heavily on her, but the fact that she had served, even unconsciously, as an instrument of revenge. This made her feel dirty, manipulated, less human. She reviewed old messages, remembered specific phrases, compliments that now sounded rehearsed. She realized that many of her lover's actions, at the time interpreted as charm or interest, were actually cold-blooded moves by someone who knew exactly where he was standing. And, more than that, who knew exactly who he wanted to destroy. The dilemma was simple yet devastating: tell Daniel everything she had discovered, even at the risk of reopening wounds he seemed to have overcome, or remain silent and bear the weight of her complicity alone. For days, she struggled. She wrote letters she never sent, recorded audio recordings she deleted before finishing. On the one hand, she knew the truth might bring some kind of justice, but on the other, she feared causing even more pain. After all, Daniel was rebuilt, serene. Bringing him back to that darkness would perhaps be selfish. But wouldn't silence also be a form of cowardice? The decision came when, unintentionally, she bumped into Daniel's new partner in a bookstore. Laura entered on impulse, seeking refuge in a neutral environment, and there she was, sitting in a corner, leafing through a book with the serenity of someone who didn't need an audience to exist. The two stared at each other for a few seconds. There was no hostility, just a silent acknowledgement of what they both knew. Laura approached, not intending to confront, but as if asking for a chance to be seen beyond her mistake. The woman, surprisingly kind, didn't move away. She simply listened as Laura, her voice breaking, said she had something she needed to give Daniel, something that might change his perception of everything. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, saying that if it was something he deserved to know, then let him know. And that she trusted he would know what to do with the truth. It was this brief encounter that sealed Laura's decision. She prepared a letter. Not a confession of love, but an honest exposition of the facts. No frills, no apologies. Just the naked truth, written in the words of someone who didn't want to be forgiven, but rather understood. She described how the man entered her life, how he introduced himself, how he seemed to know too much. She revealed the small manipulations, the moments when she sensed something wasn't right but chose to ignore it. And finally, she confessed to the conversation with Daniel's former colleague, where everything was confirmed. She ended the letter by saying she didn't expect an answer, nor redemption, but that she needed him to know that she now saw everything clearly. That she was guilty, yes, for allowing it, but that she had also been the victim of a game much bigger than she could understand at the time. The letter was delivered discreetly. And once again, Daniel read it silently, unhurriedly, on a gray afternoon, like so many others that followed. When he finished, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes. What he felt wasn't anger, nor shock. It was a different kind of pain. A cleansing pain, like the pain of removing the last thorn after years of having it stuck in the flesh. There was sadness, but also liberation. The letter didn't reopen wounds, it explained the scars. And although he had already overcome the loss, understanding the full extent of what had truly happened brought a new layer of understanding about his own past. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew Laura would take the silence as an answer. There was nothing more to say between them. But there was now a deeper understanding of what had been experienced. And from that, he could finally close that chapter definitively. On the other side, Laura didn't expect answers. But when she didn't receive them, she understood that true forgiveness doesn't come with words, it comes with time. And that, even if she never again had a place in Daniel's life, she could at least live knowing he knew the truth. The story that began with enchantment and ended in ruin was now complete. And although they had both gone their separate ways, there was something between them stronger than any resentment, the recognition that everything could have been different. And that, for that reason, it would never be forgotten. Daniel spent the following days in a state of profound introspection, as if he had crossed a final emotional frontier and now found himself in a territory where no pain was urgent, but where memory still pulsed in small details. Laura's letter, read with the calm of someone no longer expecting explanations, was the closure of something he had believed already ended. But the truth, even when it arrives late, carries a particular weight. It seeks not only to clarify the facts, but to reposition affections, transform understandings, change the place certain people occupy in our history. The revelation that Laura had been part, albeit unconsciously, of a revenge plot hatched by someone he had rejected in the past didn't surprise him, it simply made him see more clearly everything that had previously been merely stifled intuition. The manipulation behind the betrayal gave a new dimension to the suffering he had experienced, but curiously, it no longer aroused hatred. It was as if that chapter was now, finally, free of any pending issues. Her gesture of telling the truth, even belatedly, was something Daniel respected. Not for the attempt at reparation, but for the courage to touch a wound she herself had helped create. This said more about who she was now than who she had been. And, deep down, it was this that allowed him to leave her in the past once and for all, without carrying the shadows of resentment. He remained by Isabella's side, his new partner, with the same lightness and truth as before, but now with the certainty that nothing longer tied him emotionally to unresolved pain. The house they shared was being renovated, slowly becoming a home. There was a new scent, a different organization, a welcoming presence that didn't try to replace anything, just be a part of everything. It was a mature kind of love, built with patience, full of frank conversations, nights of shared silence, and mornings of realistic plans. Daniel was learning that love was also this. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but about knowing how to put it in its place. Meanwhile, Laura faced another kind of challenge. Loneliness was no longer new to her, but now it was accompanied by a kind of lucidity that made everything more painful. The silence, once filled with longing, was now filled with questions she herself didn't know how to answer. She knew she wouldn't have Daniel back, that their time was up, but she also knew that part of what had destroyed her stemmed from what she hadn't had the courage to face within herself. Her own insecurities, the void she'd always sought to fill with intense love, the eternal search for something outside, when the problem had always been within. The guilt no longer tore her apart as before, but it was there, a persistent reminder of the price of her choices. She tried to move on, filled her time with work, pursued new projects, but everything seemed too small compared to the grandeur of what she'd lost. It was during a casual conversation with her sister, on a cloudy Sunday, that she found herself faced with perhaps her greatest moral dilemma to date. Her sister, unaware of everything that had happened, casually mentioned Isabella's name. Apparently, they had a mutual acquaintance. And it was through this casual conversation that Laura discovered that Isabella had recently lost her father, and that this father was none other than the man Daniel had refused to hire years ago. The connection fell upon her like a silent avalanche. It changed everything. The man who took revenge on Daniel using Laura as his instrument was, in fact, Isabella's father. And, by one of those perverse coincidences of fate, Isabella never knew the connection between her father and the whole story. To her, her father was simply a frustrated businessman, alienated from his daughter by pride and past failures, who had died without reconciliation. She had no idea that her relationship with Daniel might have been, tragically, the consequence of a previous pain that spanned generations. Laura was paralyzed by the discovery. She didn't know what to do with it. Part of her wanted to protect Isabella, spare her from a cruel truth that would change nothing. But another part, perhaps the more honest one, knew that keeping it to herself would be repeating the mistake of before, remaining silent in the face of the essential. The truth no longer belonged solely to her. It was a matter that involved other feelings, other stories. And although she knew she might be seen as trying to interfere in what no longer concerned her, she felt that, this time, she had to do the right thing. For the first time, she wanted to make a decision with the other person's best interests in mind, even if it didn't change her own situation. After many sleepless nights, Laura decided to write again. But not to Daniel. She wrote to Isabella. The letter was short but honest. It contained no accusations, only tender words. She explained that she had recently discovered that the man she had been involved with, the same man who had approached her with murky intentions, was Isabella's father. She had never known this before, that the information had only reached her by chance, and that she felt Isabella deserved to know. She said she expected no contact, nor acceptance, but that she could not sleep peacefully knowing she was hiding something that could directly affect the woman who was now part of Daniel's life. She concluded by saying that if she chose to tear up the letter and never speak of it to anyone, she would understand. But at least now the choice was in her hands, not anyone else's. Isabella received the letter unexpectedly. She read it silently, more than once. The content was disturbing, but strangely, it brought peace. She had grown up feeling there was something unspoken between her and her father, something he never had the courage to explain. His absence in her life was a hole she had learned to work around, but not to ignore. Knowing now that her connection with Daniel could have been part of a tragic intertwining of destinies didn't change how she felt about him, but it explained a lot. And, above all, it made her see Laura in a new light. A flawed woman, yes, but one who finally seemed to be trying to act with dignity. Isabella didn't respond. But she kept the letter and decided to talk to Daniel. The meeting took place at home, on a quiet evening. She asked him to sit down, saying she needed to share something strange. She showed him the letter. Daniel read it calmly, as always. When he finished, he remained silent for several minutes. Isabella watched him, attentive but unpressured. When he finally spoke, it was in a firm and calm voice. He said it was an absurd twist of fate, but that, curiously, it didn't change anything about how he felt about her. That if life had brought them together through twisted paths, it was their responsibility to choose what to do with it now. That she didn't want to turn their relationship into a field of inherited guilt, but into a space for rebuilding. Isabella smiled, her eyes brimming with tears. She said she didn't want to carry her father's mistakes, nor relive the traumas of the past. She only wanted to continue being for Daniel what he deserved, a peaceful love. And so, contrary to what many might have expected, the truth, upon coming to light, didn't separate, it strengthened. Daniel understood that, no matter how much the past left its mark, it was the present that determined the direction of life. And in that present, he chose to remain by Isabella's side, not out of denial of what he'd experienced, but out of love for what he was living. Laura, on the other hand, for the first time in a long time, felt she had done something right. And although her story with Daniel was over, the pain of losing him was now accompanied by a maturity that only time and truth can bring. She was still alone, yes, but now she was someone who was beginning to view you with less judgment. For the first time, she had done something that didn't directly benefit her, and this, as simple as it seemed, was a giant step in rebuilding her identity. The pieces fell into place as they should. Each one in its place. Not as punishment, but as consequence. And life, with its silent wisdom, began to show signs that the end didn't have to be a punishment. It just had to be real. Because sometimes, the greatest justice lies not in revenge or reconquest, but in understanding that some losses are the seeds of what truly matters. And that, to grow again, we must let die what was no longer lifeless. Isabella decided to quit her job, move to another city, and start her life over in an environment where her name and history wouldn't carry the shadows inherited from a father who chose resentment as his legacy. She and Daniel talked for hours in the nights following the letter's revelation. There was no resentment, but a necessary pause. He respected her desire to understand everything before moving on. And she, in turn, needed distance to separate what was hers from what she had inherited, without ever asking for it. The love between them didn't fade, but transformed. It was the first time Daniel saw a new beginning truly happen, without empty promises, only with the maturity of someone who knows that love, by itself, isn't enough if there's no room for it to breathe. He helped her pack her books, carried her suitcase to the car, and, when they said goodbye, there was a kiss, yes, but also an exchange of glances that didn't say goodbye, just see you later. It wasn't an end, but a crossing. And they both knew, if there was a way back, it would be born of choice, not obligation. Daniel returned to living alone for a few months. The silent house no longer frightened him, on the contrary, it was a space for reflection and mature introspection. He spent more time with friends, resumed old hobbies, joined a book group, and even took short weekend trips. Life continued with dignity and serenity. He wasn't searching for new loves, nor was he closing himself off to the possibility. He simply understood, now more than ever, that he no longer needed to prove himself worthy of love. He had done that for too long. And for the first time, he felt whole without anyone. There was something liberating in walking alongside his own clear conscience, in knowing that, even when he was hurt, he never lost his essence. He carried the scars, yes, but now with pride. They told the story of someone who loved truly and knew how to let go, when love ceased to be a home. Meanwhile, Laura continued her solitary path with quiet dignity. She returned to therapy, rekindled her bond with her sister more deeply, began teaching at a support center for vulnerable youth, and there discovered a part of herself she hadn't known. The classes weren't just about literature, but about new beginnings. The stories she read with the teenagers often confronted her with her own mistakes, and she began to cautiously use her experience to show others that one wrong choice can change everything. There was no room for self-pity. She knew that much of the pain she experienced was a consequence of her decisions. But now she used that pain as an impetus to build something useful. She still missed Daniel, but not as before. It was a calmer, quieter feeling. She knew he would never return, but she also knew that if he were happy, then something in her could rest in peace. Laura learned to live with absence, and even more, she learned not to romanticize what she destroyed. She never tried to return, she didn't send any more letters, she didn't seek out dates. He finally accepted that some losses are not to be redeemed, but to teach us about everything that should never be done again. A year later, Isabella returned. She didn't warn him, she didn't announce it. She simply showed up at an event where she knew Daniel would be. He saw her from afar, and his heart didn't race, he simply smiled, that smile that carries recognition and pleasant surprise. She was different, more confident, lighter. He was too. They spoke naturally, without dramatization. She told him she had understood a lot about herself during that time. That she had rebuilt her image of her father, not to forgive him, but to leave him in the past. That she could now separate the man who hurt her from the one who tried to destroy Daniel. She said she still loved him, but that she wasn't rushing back. Only to show she was ready, if he still wanted to try. Daniel listened calmly, looked into her eyes, and said he had never stopped hoping for this reunion. But now the love he felt was more conscious, more demanding, more serene. And that, if they were to start over, it wouldn't be from where they left off, but from a new place, where they were both free from the past. She nodded with tears in her eyes. She wasn't crying out of sadness, but for the rare chance that love wouldn't die, just change shape until it was ready to blossom again. And so, without fanfare, two mature hearts decided to give each other another chance. Not out of necessity, but by choice. Not because they'd forgotten everything they'd experienced, but because they understood that it's possible to love again, as long as there's truth. They didn't build castles of promises. They simply began to share their daily lives, their breakfasts, the silences at the end of the day. And it was in these details that they rediscovered love, not as salvation, but as sharing. A love that didn't need to be epic, just true. Laura, for her part, continued on her way, far from them, but in peace. She never crossed paths with Daniel again, but she heard from others that he seemed well, that he had started smiling like before again. One day, passing a newsstand, she saw a column he had written in a local magazine. It talked about choices. She read it standing up, without buying it, and then she understood that, in a way, he had already written about her. She smiled to herself. It wasn't a smile of happiness, but of acceptance. Life goes on. Sometimes, with what you sow, other times, with what you learn to never sow again. And so, this story ends where it should, with each character in the place they built with their own decisions. Daniel, with a conscious, serene, and stronger love than ever. Isabella, with the freedom to be loved by someone who sees beyond the past. And Laura, with the dignity of someone who, after making a mistake, chose to grow. Because in the end, that's what life demands of us, the courage to accept the consequences of our actions and the maturity to transform pain into learning. If you've made it this far, comment below what you thought of this story. Which character touched you the most? What decision would you have made differently? Your opinion is very important, so leave it in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real and moving stories like this. And before I close, here's a thought: betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships, it destroys people, shatters homes, and disfigures memories. A thoughtless act can cause damage that time cannot mend. Because when you betray someone you love, you don't just choose someone else, you choose to kill something that may never be born again. And remember, this channel opposes any form of betrayal. Our stories are fiction, but the pain they portray is real. May these narratives serve as a mirror, a warning, and above all, a learning experience. Until next time.